Welcome, friends. I'm Chris Bishop. I'm from Transformation Nation Yoga and Wellness. Welcome to Fermentation Nation. This is the on demand version of our workshop for creating your own low sugar, small batch sauerkraut. If you regardless of whether you're taking this workshop through YouTube or you're taking it through Vimeo, if you go to the description under the video, you will find a link to a PDF that's a handout for this. Includes a lot of the information that I'll cover during the discussion here, but also includes some recipes. You may or may not choose to print that out. I think what you're going to find the process that we're going to talk about is not rocket science. It's really, really simple. You might choose to take a pen and a piece of paper and jot down a couple of notes. But if you like, if you prefer, if you print that handout in, I think you will find it to have everything that you need in it. So stop your recording and get either something to jot some notes down with or print out that handout. And when you're ready, press play and I will meet you right here for Fermentation Nation. Welcome back, friends. We'll get started with discussion, and then I'm just going to demonstrate what the process looks like. Again, I think you will find this to be pretty simple. My Ayurveda and business coach, Kate Stillman, advocates. I've read her book, Body Thrive, probably 4 times before I started enrolled in the yoga health coaching program, and she really encourages people to make their own small batch sauerkraut. The truth is, had I understood how easy this is, I would have been doing it long before. So if you take a workshop from Transformation Nation, I think you deserve to know what to expect going into it. So these are the promises. This is the target that I'm shooting at, and what I hope to deliver to you. First of all, I want to help you develop an understanding of the role of probiotics in gut microbiome health, but also other health related benefits from eating low sugar, small batch fermented foods. You'll learn the simple steps required to transform cabbage and salt into sauerkraut in between 1 and 3 weeks. You'll receive some recipes for simple and creative small batch fermented foods and for using your own homemade fermented foods. And this doesn't apply during the on demand version, but if you take a live version of this workshop with me, you will leave with a pint to a quart of finished small batch sauerkraut that you can take home and eat that evening. Um, you'll also bring a whole quart home with you to shepherd through the fermentation process. One of the values I think outside of health of artisanal small batch fermented foods is it really does connect us to our cultural heritage. People have been using fermentation to preserve raw vegetables without heat for at least the last 7,000 years. And over the last 150, 170 years, people really matured in their understanding of the process, why it works, and how it works. This common preservation practice really brought food to impoverished populations at points across the globe. If you look at places, the origin of where fermented foods come from, it really is all over the world. So it's pretty cool. So in addition to the health benefits that we get, they really do connect us to our collective cultural heritage. I'd like to introduce you to the fermenters. So the star of our show is uh, is a bacterium called Lactobacillus reuteri. In this process, we use a process called lactic acid fermentation. Beneficial yeast, molds, and bacteria, and here I'm talking specifically about Lactobacillus reuteri, work under anaerobic conditions. What are anaerobic conditions? This work happens in the absence of oxygen. So I'm going to tell you this Fermentista's mantra now, but you're going to hear this from me several times in the workshop today. Submerge in brine and all will be fine. Submerge in brine and all will be fine. Lactobacillus reuteri survives really well under the surface of the brine. It cannot survive in oxygen. Harmful yeast, molds, and bacteria can survive in oxygen, can't survive under the brine. So one of the principles of being effective, successful, and safe in your own, making your own small batch fermented foods is making sure that everything is below the surface of the brine that you're going to create. In the process of the lactic acid fermentation, the sugars and starches that are in the cabbage are transformed into alcohols and acids. So this increases nutrients. It also makes them more bioavailable, and it helps to preserve the foods. So I'd like to give you more detail about the increased nutrients that I mentioned, but also some of the other health benefits. It is said that 70% of immune system response happens in the gut, right? And so the gut certainly boosts immune system. Why? Because a healthy gut produces all kinds of things that help with a healthy immune system response, like antibiotics, anti-tumor substances, antifungal substances, and antiviral substances. Um, this fermentation process, eating low batch, low sugar, small batch fermented foods, it neutralizes anti-nutrients like phytic acids. So why is phytic acid an anti-nutrient? Because it blocks the absorption of certain minerals. The fermentation process, this lactic acid fermentation, also increases vitamin and nutrient content and bioavailability. So it increases vitamin C. So cabbage has vitamin C. Put it through the fermentation process, the vitamin C increases. Cabbage has iron. You put cabbage through the fermentation process, the iron content is thought to increase by 16%. There are enzymes that support improved digestion, and in fact, the fermentation process pre-digests the sauerkraut. It also creates probiotics. The last thing that I wanted to mention is the fermentation process renders vitamin B12. Why is this significant? So if you're on a whole foods plant-based diet or a predominantly whole foods plant-based diet, you may feel like you have to supplement with vitamin B12. That's advice that I got from physicians for years. If you're vegan, you can't get vitamin B12 from vegetables. You can only get it from animal products. You should be supplementing vitamin B12. Well, if you're consistently, and I'm going to tell you later what I think consistently looks like and why you should be consistent in this, but if you're consistently eating low sugar, small batch fermented foods, the process renders vitamin B12. You do not have to supplement it. So with gut health, there's really, my best understanding is there's really only three protocols to improve and boost gut health, although there are a crap ton of things that we could not do. There are a bunch of things that we could give up to boost gut health. Things that we could do, breathing through the nose is really, really key. Um, Exhaling through the mouth is just fine. Inhaling, it must be done through the nose. There are times if we've got a broken nose, or sometimes people have a structural issue, but long term we should be working toward correcting that and breathing through the nose to ensure a consistent production of nitric oxide. Um, like all our mothers told us, is to keep the hands clean and avoid touching the eyes. So in the immune system, the first layer of defense is the skin. And any opening in the skin, whether it was a natural opening that we're born with, or whether it's a wound that we get, or like dry, cracked skin, or what have you, is a potential opportunity for some kind of a threat or some kind of a stressor to enter and compromise the immunity of the system, right? So the eyes are a primary vector of these threats to our health getting in. But tied into our workshop today, and the thing like you already knew to breathe through your nose, you already knew to keep your hands clean and not touch your eyes. Um, if you want to optimize for gut health, especially gut health for immune system function, um, eat 3 to 6 small servings of low sugar fermented foods. What's a small serving? Small serving is 6 ounces. That's 3/4 of a cup. So by some measurements, that's not really a very small serving. But if you want to optimize for gut health, 3 to 5 servings of fermented foods is the way to go. Now, you can buy sauerkraut or kimchi in the grocery store. I would argue if you buy it and it's room temperature, like I bought sauerkraut before in a can, it doesn't taste light years away, maybe from the sauerkraut that you would buy in the refrigerated section, but it's not going to have these same health benefits that we're talking about, right? That's just a benchmark. It's not because it was in a can. It's because it's not that. That's just an indicator. What you want is something that either you made at home or that you got from the refrigerated section of the grocery store. Now, if you've bought sauerkraut from the refrigerated section of the grocery store recently, um, you'll probably know it's not inexpensive. It's not inexpensive. So, like, this is another reason. The ingredients we're talking about, like for a basic sauerkraut recipe, what you need are cabbage and salt. That is it. Easy peasy. And those are two very inexpensive ingredients. Now, there are some potential hazards. So, like, first of all, this is probably a no-brainer, but if I'm going to talk about hazards, I'm going to talk about everything I can think of. One potential hazard are cuts from sharp objects. Now, I've gotten much worse cuts from dull knives than I have from sharp knives, but I've cut myself on both, right? So, like, just be mindful that sharpened edge of the knife that you're using, just view it for exactly what it is. It is a surface that could potentially harm you gravely if it's misused. A second hazard, and this might not be something that you would potentially think about, but cuts and damages from exploding jars. So I'm going to talk to you when I talk about what I use in my fermentation system of an airlock system. You don't have to use an airlock system. So we want to minimize exposure to the air, but we need to balance that with allowing it to breathe. Because as it goes through the lactic acid fermentation process, it expels carbon dioxide, right? So if you have a jar of sauerkraut that you wind up tight and you don't vent it, it will explode the jar. Now, this doesn't mean that it's going to be a really dramatic explosion, um, although potentially, I think that's not likely, but the potential is there. But the big thing is it's going to create a mess that you don't want to clean up. And any goodwill that you maintain from the people with whom you're sharing your space, where you're going through this fermentation process, will be further compromised if you have an exploding jar that creates a hell of a mess in the pantry. The other hazard that I just wanted to bring to your mind, like food that's exposed to harmful bacteria, yeast, and fungi. So if you don't have, I'm going to talk to you about a weighted layer in your fermentation process. It's called the secondary follower, right? The job of the secondary follower is to push everything down into the brine and to keep everything below the level of the brine. If you're not using that, that cabbage or whatever vegetables you're fermenting, they will expand, and what gets up above the level of the brine will probably grow some mold or fungi. Now, that doesn't necessarily ruin the batch, right? If you read old school stories of people like in Germany, kids that got sent to the pantry to get sauerkraut, they lift up the level of mold and then they'd scoop out fresh sauerkraut, right? So what I would do if you have that happen in your process, that's okay, no worries. Um, Remove all the molded portion, get that layer out of there, and then do a close inspection and check with your sense of smell everything that's left in there. If it is foul smelling, throw it out, start over. Again, cabbage and salt are not expensive. The timeline that we're talking about, you can start tasting your fermented foods after 4 days. It's not going to be a really time consuming process either. Better safe than sorry. Coming back to our mantra, submerge in brine and all will be fine. So, as for best practices, cleanliness is next to godliness. So, if we're going to have some kind of a pathogen, some kind of a bad yeast, some kind of a bad mold, some kind of a bad bacteria, it's probably going to come from an unclean surface or from using a vegetable that's not clean. So, make sure that everything is clean. Again, we want to avoid exposure to air and allow our ferment to vent out carbon dioxide. So one of the other dangers, if you don't put a lid over it, um, is it will the brine will evaporate. So I've got a friend who made some at home recently. he had to throw the whole batch out. He didn't have a lid on the top. It dried out and everything got moldy. So again, we want to avoid exposure to air, both for the potential introduction of yeast molds and bacteria that we don't want, and we also want to preserve that precious brine rather, in the ferment. So again, third time for our mantra today: submerge in brine, we'll be fine. If we're talking about best practices for fermentation, in the short amount of time that I've been doing this, I've really come to appreciate the airlock system. So if you look at these photos here, these are special lids that are made, that have, it's a regular top lid, but it's got a port with a washer that seals in, and then it's got a system. There's a removable cap at the top that's got little air holes in it, and there's a water barrier, and there's a little cup on the inside that can ride up. So if there's a bubble of carbon dioxide, it can lift up, remove the bubble, the carbon dioxide vents out the top, right? So it minimizes evaporation. It allows the carbon dioxide to vent. You're not going to get an exploding jar in this case. What it really does is it can allow us as a fermentista to be a little less vigilant in the monitoring. I'm going to argue that you're still going to want to monitor your ferment and pay pretty close attention to it, but using the airlock system is much more forgiving. So you can order a set of, say, 4 to 6 airlock systems like this for quart-sized jars through Amazon or through a fermentation supply company for a matter of $15. So it's not a big and expensive investment. And it's one, again, if you're going to do this consistently, I think for your peace of mind and to allow you to be able to relax a little bit and enjoy this process, I really advocate and recommend the airlock system. As far as best practices, the last thing that I would mention is you want to maintain a fairly constant air temperature that is compatible with creating fermented food. So that's between 55 and 75 degrees. So if you live in a climate where you can leave the ferment out in a barn and it can stay at 55 to 75 degrees, you're golden. If you live in a place that has an underground basement, that might work out really well. For me, this means under a sink or in a pantry. And I'll show you the space that I'm using in the place where I'm staying right now. As for the tools of the fermentista, so you can get fancy. Like you can buy the airlocks. You can buy, I mentioned the secondary follower, the weight that keeps everything pressed down below the brine. I use a glass secondary follower. You can use ones of wood and or ceramic as well. But you don't have to get fancy. So the basic tools of the fermentista are a cutting board, a knife, and a bowl. You need cabbage and salt. You can add other ingredients. So the batch that we're going to make in this video today that I'm going to demonstrate for you, I'm also going to put caraway seeds in. And I'll tell you why specifically caraway while we're making that. You're going to want a tamper. So a tamper is just a device that you can use to press down your ferment into the fermentation and storage vessels. Um, this presses out any air bubbles, so it removes the potential for oxygen in there. It also allows the brine oil to come up to the surface, right? So you're going to want to do that when you put your fermented vegetables into the fermentation vessel, but also into the storage vessel. You're going to need a primary follower. Now, the role of the primary follower, it goes in the fermentation vessel immediately on top of the fermented vegetables. So in case of sauerkraut, this goes right directly on top of the sauerkraut, right? And so that it serves as a little bit of a barrier. Um, for sauerkraut, what I would do is use parts of the outer edges of the leaf. It works really well. It's something you would probably throw out or compost anyway. You can use plastic wrap, right? I'm going to talk about plastic a couple times here. I don't know that you would get, this is food grade. When we're talking about plastic wrap, we're talking about food grade plastic. When we're talking about Ziploc bags, we're talking about food grade plastic. I don't like plastic touching something that I'm going to eat. It makes me nervous and I'm uncomfortable with the idea that there may be things that leach out of the plastic. So I'm going to choose a cabbage leaf. You got the cabbage leaves anyway. The other thing you can use, you can buy grape leaves, and there are a few other plants that the leaves work really well as a primary follower. So again, primary follower sits directly on top of the fermented vegetables. I've referenced a couple times the secondary follower. The secondary follower sits directly on top of the primary follower. Its job is to weight everything down and keep everything pressed down below the level of the brine. So I use glass for the primary followers. Again, through Amazon, I can order a set of um, 6 glass secondary followers that perfectly fit. They were made to fit mason jars for fermenting for like $18. Um, if you're not doing this commercially, and if you're watching my workshop, I'm guessing you're not, right? You're just doing this for you. 6 is probably all you're going to ever need. So you might not choose to start with those glass followers, but maybe work toward that. You could also use like a small Ziploc bag filled, not filled, but like half filled with water and sealed really well. You do want to make sure it's really well sealed. You don't want fresh water intruding in your ferment. But a Ziploc baggie can also work. You want a vented lid. So again, either a lid that you come around periodically and you let off carbon dioxide, or maybe just leave it sitting on top of the batch, or better yet, get these airlocks. Again, friends, if you work toward that, doesn't it doesn't cost a lot of money. They're not expensive. I think you'll get pretty good if you're taking good care of them. I think you get really good life out of them, and I think you'll find it to be a good investment. The only other tools that you're going to need are time, patience, and monitoring. You are going to want to keep an eye on your fermenting vegetables. During the fermentation process, there's a little bit of vigilance that's required. Again, considerably less vigilant with the airlock system than without, but you are going to want to be vigilant and watch this. And as for time, like the way that it works, you can start eating and testing your sauerkraut after 4 days. So on day number 5, if you want to start tasting it, it's fine. And you might choose to keep it fermenting for as much as 3 weeks. This is all going to come down to personal preference. The longer you let it ferment, the more sour the taste is going to be. So if you like a little bit of sour, go with a shorter amount of time, something closer to that 5 days. If you like it really sour, go closer to the 3 weeks. I don't know of any good reason why it makes sense to go beyond 3 weeks, but you'll figure this out with experience. So to manage the fermentation process, it's a really pretty simple process. So I'm going to go over with you today the preparation, the cutting, brining, packing, sealing. I'm going to show you some fermented vegetables that I have in the process, and I'm also going to show you some that I'm storing. But those are really the 8 steps that I've laid out here. And it's kind of cheesy that I included enjoying, but I also think like take some joy in this. This is something. It's delicious. It's really healthy. Ties us into our cultural heritage. So if you can, enjoy the process along the way. But if you've got these 8 steps as part of your process, you'll have a really solid process. So now I'm going to walk you through this process. All right, friends. During the slideshow, I showed you some of the tools of the Fermentista, but let's look at what I'm working with real time here. So I have a good clean cutting board. I have a nice sharp knife. Of a mixing bowl. Now, in general, everything you're going to read with fermented foods, you want non-reactive, so probably wooden or ceramic. Um, I think later in the process, that's really important. Uh, I will tell you, there's 2 things. I've used a plastic bowl, but I'm going to process 2 heads of cabbage today. Um, with 2 heads of cabbage, this gigantic bowl will be full at first. You'll see very quickly how the salt desiccates and pulls the water out of the cells of the cabbage, and by the end, you wouldn't need a bowl anywhere near that size. But to start, we're going to need this, and I think it would be fine. So starting with a metal bowl, not perfect, not ideal, but I think we'll be just fine. With 2 heads of cabbage, my experience is it makes about 3 quarts of fermented vegetables. So you could use either a gallon-sized mason jar or what I'm going to use today, is 3-quart-size mason jar. In between scenes here, I will take a black indelible magic marker and I'll just put the date on here. You're going to want to probably keep track of what the dates are. I have a tamper, right? So this is the tamper that I'm going to use. It was specially made for fermented foods. But I mentioned, like, my girlfriend has a Vitamix. I've used a plastic one for the Vitamix. That works really well. If you're using, say, a gallon-sized mason jar, you might be able to use your fist, or if you have smaller hands. I've decidedly medium hands and wrists. They will not fit into a quart-sized mason jar, but your hands might. That's an option. I have the airlock system. So I have these lids here. The lid has a port in the top that's secured by a washer. And then in the very top, this will insert into the port. I'll fill this about halfway up with water, pop that little plastic cap down, and then a vented cap goes on the whole kit and caboodle. And then I'll press that down once we reach that point. Now, in terms of the followers, so the primary follower, what we're going to use today, again, the primary follower is that first layer of defense as the first seal goes directly on top of the fermented vegetables. These outer leaves are in really good shape, and I would choose to peel them off and throw them out anyway. I'm going to use cabbage leaves as a primary follower, and if you're doing any kind of cabbage-based ferment, that's what I recommend. For the secondary follower, what I'm going to use, I mentioned I like these glass, but you can get wooden ones, you can get ceramic ones, um, no problem. Again, I get about 6 of these through Amazon for $18, so not a big investment. But you could, if you don't have those glass ferments, or you're just not inclined to spend money like that. This is, my girlfriend has these in her pantry. This is a Ziploc square snack bag. So it's a really small Ziploc bag. If you half fill it with water, make sure it's good and sealed. You don't want fresh water intruding. That can be your secondary follower set on top of the cabbage leaves. This brings us to our food. So 2 heads of cabbage. I will, in between sets, I will wash this. You don't need me to show you how to wash cabbage. You know how to do that. Salt. Any kind of sea salt will do, but I like this pink Himalayan sea salt. And it's an extra ingredient. You don't strictly need it. Today I'm going to mix in caraway seeds as well. While I'm massaging the cabbage, I'll tell you why caraway seeds. And I am going to use a tablespoon measure for the salt. I recommend, unless you, like, some people who've cooked for a long time don't have to measure anything anymore. I've done a lot of cooking, including commercially in restaurants, and I'm going to tell you I'm not there yet. I'm still going to measure. And that's really all you're going to need. So I'm going to wash the cabbage, I'm going to label our jars, and then we'll get started processing the cabbage. All right, I've got our cabbage all washed. Sometimes I cut the little nub off the end, sometimes I don't. I'll do it here just to demonstrate that. And at this point, cut your cabbage in two. And then quarter your cabbage. So I washed the cabbage. After I washed it, I also toweled it off to remove any excess water. Now we want to remove the core. So I just cut a diagonal angle, get this little piece out. That would not ferment very well. We'll do the same thing for the other side. And then we can start to cut it. Now you're going to have to experiment with this a little bit. So I like thin slices, but you'll have to work with it and see what works for you, because if you go too thin, it can get really limp in the ferment. But if you go too thick, it doesn't ferment well, and you're not going to get a consistent texture. But with a little bit of practice, and you try this a few times, and in the end, for your sauerkraut that you make, it doesn't really matter what I like. It's what you like. So again, we want, for me, if I'm going to make this, if I'm going to go through the process, I'm going to use at least 2 cabbages. So if I include, usually, like I know I said 3 to 6 small servings, and I do think that's the goal. but I eat on an intermittent fasting cycle, so I only really eat twice a day. I eat one main meal at about noon, and then I have something really light at 6. So that's or before 6 rather. So that's like two small meals a day. I have about a 6-ounce serving of sauerkraut at each of those meals. So the reason I told you that, even at that, at two 6-ounce servings, I go through a quart-sized jar because the jars aren't going to be chock full. We're going to have to leave a little space in there, and I'll show you why that is. But I go through one of those jars in between 2 or 3 days. So if I make if I use two cabbages to make about 3 quarts, that sounds like a lot. That's only a week's worth of sauerkraut for me. Right, so that's half a cabbage, and you can see that's already taken up quite a lot of space in the bowl. So I'm going to cut up the rest of these cabbages, and then we'll come back together and we will salt the cabbage. All right, we have our two cabbages all cut up, so it's not cut up perfectly consistently, but it's pretty darn consistent. It looks really good. Uh, in between, I wiped down all our surfaces again. I cleaned equipment. If we're going to have best practices, among the best practices, I could think of 4 things that I would advocate. And one is making sure that we have good, clean equipment. Clean equipment prevents the bad mold, fungi, and bacteria from getting into the ferment, the things that are going to hurt us. Now, I'm going to choose to use caraway seeds. So I'm going to put in about a tablespoon and a half. Looks closer to 2 tablespoons. That's just fine. The salt is a little bit more important. For my experiences, for each head of cabbage, you want about a tablespoon and a quarter of salt. Now, there is a mathematical formula. Like if you want to get fancy, and I'm not giving you that formula because, frankly, I don't use it. When I first started digging into this and checking out some resources to see what we need to do, to make sauerkraut, they gave like if you weigh the cabbage and you divide it by this, then this is the amount of salt that you put in. And what I decided was, if it involves math, that's not really what I signed on for. And what I've since learned is it doesn't need to be nearly that exact. All right, so now what we're doing right now is just mixing, right? Because we want to bring this pink Himalayan sea salt into contact with as much of our cabbage as possible. Right, so right now, look how full this bowl is. I'd like you to pay pretty close attention to this. What you're going to see after we've got most of the cabbage coming into contact with salt, we're going to allow it to rest, and then I'll come back in a little bit, and I'll give it a little bit of a break, 15 or 20 minutes. I'll come back, I'll really massage it, and you'll see the process. You'll be able to watch the process of the salt desiccating and pulling water from the cells in the cabbage. But for now, this step right here is really just mixing. Right? And I can see some caraway seeds in here. They're visible for sure, but it also doesn't look like an overwhelming amount. So you could do this with other spices too. So one of the simple recipes that I will put in the handout for this workshop, I've made a batch of this that with just red pepper flakes. Right, red pepper flakes work really well to give it a nice spice, but it's the same thing. You can put it in at the same time as the salt. Just massage it all in together and allow it to all ferment together. And with most spices, that's the case. There are a handful of exceptions, and frankly, nothing I've tried, but just things that I've read about where you want to wait until later in the process to add something. But by and large, for those spices, you can put them in right from the very beginning. Ditto with other vegetables. So, like one of the recipes, like I made a batch with carrot and epazote, and I peeled my carrot, and I used the peeler to render the carrot into thin strips. The epazote, I washed it really well, separated the leaves from the stems, and I just threw the episote leaves in whole, mixed them all together, let them sweat, and then I'd bring it all back together. So that's it, friends. I would say that is well mixed. I'm going to clean all the surfaces again, and I'll give this about 15 minutes to sweat and to breathe. All right, friends, if you remember, when we left off, we were mixing, and mixing is part of a larger process called brining. So I don't know that the camera will capture this very well, but if you were here in person, you'd be able to see the cabbage leaves tangibly sweating, right? So fluid is coming out of there. So now the second part of brining is just giving this a nice massage, rubbing it all together. Now, of course, if there's any areas where the salt didn't get mixed into the cabbage before, this is going to help address that. And you will see over time, the cabbage will get smaller and smaller, and you'll see some brine start to build up in the bottom of the bowl. Now, some of the brine, like it'll continue to create. The salt will continue to do its work on the cabbage. But the brine is pretty precious. It's really one of the most important parts of the process. So I mentioned one best practices was to use clean equipment. A second best practice is to avoid exposure to air. So if you remember our mantra, submerge in brine, and all will be fine. The brine is a really important part of the process here. So it is of tantamount importance in being safe and coming up with an end result that we're really happy about and excited to eat and excited to share with our family, our friends, and any other loved ones. So once you get into rhythm, like you've made, I don't know, 5 or 6 batches of sauerkraut, I think what you'll find, it's not going to take you a lot of time. You can process 2 cabbages and make a batch of sauerkraut in probably about 40 minutes. So remember, if you remember what I said about, like if you buy refrigerated sauerkraut from the refrigerated section of the grocery store, it's pretty expensive. But to be able to make, enough to fill 3-quart jars and leave them enough space for it to work through the process, for the amount of money that you spend on cabbage and a little bit of salt, plus 45 minutes of your time, just fine. And the time you could, if you wanted, I think this is a nice mindfulness process. I like just being here in the moment and doing this, but you could also, after you've done this a few times, easily pull this off listening to a podcast or maybe even having something on the television if you were inclined to do so. If you've got kiddos too, this might be a fun bonding activity. It might be something that your kids enjoy. Maybe not after the second time, right? But when it's new, when it's novel, another way for you to spend time together. And I don't know about for you, but like my memories of my parents, like being in a food co-op and getting orders of bulk food and packing things down into um, the increments of the individual orders from the families who ordered it. Those are really happy, fond family memories for me. So maybe your version of that for your kids will be making sauerkraut together. Or maybe it'll be something completely different. Right. I don't know that I'm going to be able to tip this up yet in a way that you can see it, but we've got brine that is gathering at the bottom of the bowl, which is perfect. That's exactly what we want. So I mentioned I wasn't going to do a mathematical equation to make sauerkraut. You could weigh your cabbage, and you could get the formula for the exact amount of salt that you want to add. But I think a better way to do that, I don't typically taste it, but everybody that I've talked to and everything I've read about it really recommends that as you salt your cabbage, you taste it, and over time with experience, you know what the salt flavor, the level of salt flavor is that brings you the kind of fermenting action that you want. I will tell you, my first batch, I put a little bit less salt. I put about a tablespoon per head of cabbage in my first batch, and it fermented well. It ended up being good, but it was a slower ferment. And for the second, I upped the salt up to about a tablespoon and a quarter, and it was a really active ferment. It was really cool to watch. So I talked about two best practices. A third is maintaining a good fermentation temperature. So keeping it in a space that's fairly consistent. And the range of temperature that you want is at least 55 degrees Fahrenheit, but probably not more than 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, at higher than 75, it's not that it won't ferment, but it will ferment too fast. And you're probably not going to be very happy with the outcome, what you get from it. Right? Take a look and see, I think you'll be able to notice from where we started, there's a dramatic reduction in the volume of the cabbage. This is just the process of the salt doing its job and desiccating the water from the cells of the cabbage. So I'm going to massage this for 2 or 3 more minutes, and then I'll clean everything up again, wash my hands, and we'll start the process of packing. Okay, so the brining process is complete, and in the bottom of the bowl, you can probably see some brine spilling up to the surface, right? So we're going to start the process of packing. So again, 2 cabbages makes about 3-quart jars. So I'm going to show you one, and then in the next iteration, I'll show you the next steps from here. So I mentioned temperature, 55 to 75 degrees. What I failed to mention is you also want something that's low light. So it doesn't have to be dark, 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 like pitch dark, but you want something that's out of direct sunlight. So the way that I would approach this is do a little at a time, pack your cabbage in there, and then use your tamper and tamp it down. As you tamp it down, if you've done a good job creating the brine, you'll see the brine rise up to the surface. I mentioned I put caraway seeds in this. Why caraway seeds? Well, Kate, my Ayurveda teacher, would tell you, when we start as Westerners delving into Ayurveda, this ancient healing system from India, we start eating Indian foods and khicheris, and we start applying Ayurveda with traditional Ayurvedic recipes. But my understanding from Kate is that like a lot of what Ayurveda has to do with is really how our grandparents and great grandparents ate. So what were the spices? What were the seeds? What were the things that of our genetic stock? So my genetic material is almost entirely Northern European. It's as boring and plain vanilla as you can want. And I remember as a kid at my in Eastern Maine being at my grandparents' historic farm property, and it had been my great grandparents, and eventually my grandparents raised that farmhouse down, and they built their retirement home right there. But when I was a kid and the old farmhouse was there, out in that front field, there were all these plants. And I remember my parents and my aunts and uncles showing us, helping us identify these plants as caraway, picking the caraway seeds and eating them out there in the field. Great family memory for me, but also a great way to bring your family heritage and like try to make this like, I don't think the folks in my family probably ate a whole bunch of sauerkraut, but I know they ate caraway seeds. So how can you take this and give it a little bit of a twist for your cultural background? All right, friends. So I'm gonna pack the other 2 jars, and then I'll be back with you in a minute. We'll install the primary and secondary follower. All right, friends. The packing's complete, and it turns out, nice surprise. In this particular batch, I had enough for 4 jars. Thankfully, I had another clean jar. I had everything else that I needed. So now we're gonna get to the sealing. So primary follower again. I'm gonna choose to use a cabbage leaf here. So tuck the cabbage leaf in, press it down. I like to take the tamper, use the tamper, tamp your primary follower down. And ideally, we want the primary tamper below the level of brine as well. So you can probably see the brine squeezing up around all the cabbage. The good news is too, like this was almost foaming by the time I finished with the brining process. So that's a good sign. It will continue to make brine. So next step is we used a cabbage leaf for the primary follower. We're going to use a glass secondary follower. Again, you could use a plastic bag. I'll put the lid on. Now, for the airlock, I had this staged. So not quite half full of water. This little plastic piece I'll drop on top of there. And then I have a lid with an airlock and just press just the tip of that down into our jar. So we have a clean, well labeled, well brined, well packed batch of day one sauerkraut. You can start experimenting with eating it about 4 days afterwards. I like it after about 10 days, but you're going to have to play with that and adjust it and get it the way that you like it. So when we meet up again, I'm going to talk to you about the fermentation, storing it for fermentation purposes, and also the monitoring, what to look for. All right. So since I started this, I've been fermenting my own foods for a short amount of time. Since I started it, I've realized I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, right? So long term, I'll come up with a pretty fancy setup, probably in the utility room. I'm about to move into my own place, and I got a place all picked out. But in the meantime, especially if you're sharing space with other people, you need to be considerate with them. You'll be able to smell the ferments, and especially for people who don't like sauerkraut, the smell can be off-putting. I will tell you, I also made one of the recipes that I'll share with you in the handout is for a sauerkraut with a kimchi spice profile. Kimchi, I don't know. When I was an army linguist, my language was Korean, so I got lots of opportunities to experience kimchi. Tastes wonderful, doesn't necessarily smell wonderful, right? So it can put off a smell. So you need to think about that and be thoughtful about the people with whom you live. Now, with the monitoring, this is a batch of what's left of a batch of a combination of red cabbage and green cabbage that I started on February 22nd. Today is March the 1st. So what I would look for when you're monitoring, check your airlocks, right? It's fun. I usually check my ferments 2 or 3 times a day. It's fun for me to watch the carbon dioxide bubble from the bottom to the top and out through the airlock. But because it will continue to make brine, at some point for some of your ferments, you'll have a point where the brine starts to come up into the airlock. And if you're not careful, it will spill over. So here, that would be a problem. I just have this on a towel on a laminate floor. Long term, if this is something you're going to be doing long term, I would get some kind of a cookie sheet or something that will capture anything that may spill over, and that will just allow you to relax a little bit. Again, you can start tasting it after 4 days, and you probably don't want to ferment it longer than 3 weeks. All right, so I'm going to put today's batch in here. So how do you know the ferment is working? You will start to see it looking more active. So putting out air bubbles as that carbon dioxide starts to exit. Also notice, if you notice this beautiful bright green color of the green cabbage sauerkraut here, have you ever seen a batch of mature sauerkraut that green? No. If it's fermenting, one of the things you will notice, if you come back here in 4 days, the bright green color will have all faded to a pale yellow. All right, the part of the process that I haven't talked about so much yet is storing. So what the experts say is when you're done, when your fermented vegetable is at a point in the process where it's the right amount of sour for you, and only you can be the decision maker on that. They recommend you put it in a vessel that the smallest amount of the size. So with that quart-sized jar, you notice some space on top for the followers and allow the brine to expand. So they would recommend packing that down into smaller jars, pressing it down with a tamper and putting it up like that. That's prudent. That's prudent, right? I'm going to tell you, I don't do that. So the longest this is going to last in my refrigerator, once I get it done with the fermentation process, is probably 3 days. So I do, after I scoop each serving out, I press the vegetables back down into the brine the best that I can, and then I take it out the next day and I enjoy it. Um, The way it usually works for me, I don't know what your experience will be, but for me, usually by a week, I've waited as long as I'm willing to wait, and I'm ready um, to start eating it. Most of the time, I'm experimenting with something new. I'm really curious what it's going to taste like. By the time I've eaten the first jar, I usually use the let the second and third jar continue to ferment while I'm doing that. At some point, once it gets to like once I've got enough sauerkraut made that I'm not making it just to consume, and I'm starting to put some up and getting a little bit ahead in the process, it will be a little bit easier for me to just decide this is fermented enough and to take it out and to store it. As for enjoying it, again, I just put it in a bowl. I have about 6 ounces twice a day. This is great on sandwiches. It can be nice on eggs. If you're interested in a book with tons and tons of recipe for different fermented vegetables, including a crap ton of kimchis and sauerkrauts, but lots of other fermented vegetables too, check out Kirsten and Christopher Shockey's Fermented Vegetables. It's about 300 pages. It's interesting. It's a really good read. It's well written from a technical writing standpoint. And they've got not just lots of recipes, step by step instructions for making your own fermented vegetables, they also have recipes for ways that you could use them as well. All right. So, over the last um, hour or so, uh, what I hope I did is to help you to understand the role of probiotics in gut health and also help you realize some health related benefits that we get from low sugar, small batch fermented foods. I showed you the simple steps required to transform cabbage and salt into sauerkraut in 1 to 3 weeks. Um, in the handout, you'll find some recipes. So primarily just regular plain old sauerkraut. But I've got 3 or 4 other recipes too for variations that are creative, that are fun, and that might tie more into your cultural heritage. So take a look at those and see what you think. Um, I hope this has been a good use of time for you. If you have questions or comments, know that you can continue to reach out to me, and I will. I'm here to be of service to you. So if you've taken this workshop and you've got some questions, or you experiment with things and it doesn't work quite like you thought and want to talk it through, you can reach out to me. Right now, I'm on both Facebook and Instagram. Facebook is probably going to go away for me in the fall. I'm moving Transformation Nation over to Telegram. But I'm anticipating being on Instagram for a while. You could also find me through my website, Transformation Nation, yogaandwellness.com, or you could email me, Chris at transformationnationyogaandwellness.com. Last, my cell phone number, and I would I strongly prefer text message uh, to a phone call. Um, but my phone number is 281-728-3896. Friends, again, I'm Chris. I'm from Transformation Nation Yoga and Wellness. This has been our Fermentation Nation workshop. This was an introduction to you for creating your own low sugar, small batch fermented foods. I hope you have a great time with the process, and I hope you're able to realize all the health benefits that these wonderful foods with this ancient preservation technology can bring to your life.